Thank you, Reed. I really appreciate it. Ron, alcoholic, delighted to be back again, and delighted again, Reed and Pavillon, for allowing me to have fun doing these cool things. So the short story on me, just to qualify, I said last week, I'm a guy who loses control of his drinking and all his bodily functions when I do drink. The notion of powerlessness was a mind-blowing thing for me. My short story was that for 9 years, almost every day, I said I wasn't going to drink, and I failed every day for 9 years. And it was my sponsor who helped me see that that would be called powerlessness. Saying that you're going to not, and then doing it, is a demonstration of powerlessness day after day after day. That was December 28th, 1985, when this path in recovery began. So I'm about 36 years sober. And I've been the beneficiary of some extraordinarily good sponsorships, some extraordinarily good therapy, and some really great spiritual advice, which is what brings me to this topic. So last week, we started with introducing this idea of strengths. And one of the things I said about this, because I got to do a little bit of a summary for people who are here for the first time tonight or who hear this first. We humans and people in recovery spend a lot of time looking at what's wrong with us, and we need to do that. But there's this whole other frame that is the stuff that's right with us. So here's the summary of what happens for most of us when we come into recovery. The first thing is we got to quit drinking and drugging. We just, you got to start there. And for some of us, that takes a long time, and that is perfectly okay. There's some interesting research that shows that the single most likely predictor of sobriety is never quitting. Like, really remarkable. You just keep trying to quit, and sooner or later, your odds of success go up. So we got to quit drinking. Then we jump into the steps, hopefully, because as a friend of mine likes to say, you do not collect recovery through osmosis, setting in meetings. My first sponsor used to always say, meetings are a place that we can practice the recovery program. They're not the recovery program. And usually that's through the steps for most of us. So we do the steps. And as I said last week, first time through the steps, most of us, it's just a long list of crap we got to clean up. And that's especially important because we need to get past the guilt and the shame that so many of us carry. So then at some point in time, we usually find that we're going to have to go more deeply into the steps. You get 7 years sober, 12 years sober, you get some time under your belt, and at some point in time, you realize there's some things that haven't resolved themselves. And a good sponsor or a good meeting will say, well, let's go deeper into the steps. And I mentioned last week that what my experience in this progressive recovery space is that we start looking for what the big book calls old ideas, the things that we carry within us. And if you know the big book language, it says many of us have tried to hold on to our old ideas, and the result was nil until we let go absolutely. So for example, if I'm walking around on planet Earth thinking I'm a lousy, rotten human being, I am bringing a whole lot of problems with me simply by having that belief about myself. Another thing we begin to look for is decisions based on self. For example, we might have learned that trying to find some easy way to live was the whole point of it all. And then we can't find an easy way to live, but we keep trying over and over again. And at some point, and this comes out of the writings of Bill W., we've got to start looking at how we were damaged by life, because most of us have stories about what happened to us, and we get to inventory those too. And that takes us more deeply into understanding really the roots of why our behavior, and I said last week, I'm going to say it again, AA, recovery is not a behavior improvement program. If we could improve our behavior, we would have figured it out a long time ago and wouldn't need this program. It's about a psychic change. It's about an inner transformation. It's about being made different in a way that then allows our behavior to change because our insides have changed. And then at some point in time in this advancing progressive program of recovery, we get a chance to look at strengths. And those strengths are sometimes the flip side of what are actually what we call character defects. They can be character assets. And we're really going to look at that tonight as we move into the steps with how we do this. So my summary last week was, we got to look at what's wrong with us because we do bring some stuff with us, our tattered histories and difficult relationships and all that. And we have to look at what happened to us because most of us have a story about things that came to pass, usually in our family of origin and the communities in which we were raised, that have set us on a path. And of course, somewhere in there is whatever predisposition we have for addiction, the genetic stuff, the disease part. And then we also have to look at what's right with us. Bill W. wrote in the Big Book at one point that when a lot of those early alcoholics cleaned up, they actually proved to be incredibly productive members of society. So that there's a whole lot of, he would propose, there's a whole lot of good stuff inside us. That's this strengths stuff. So let me give you an example of a guy I'm going to call Jack. Jack's a guy I've worked with for some time. And he took about 3 years to really get clean and sober, coming in off alcohol and drugs. And it took 3 years because he got sober and then he lost his way, but he kept coming to meetings but wouldn't admit it. And then eventually he made it back in and got clean and sober. His first go at the steps was about cleaning up the carnage. He had a lot of financial amends to make. He had really pretty devastated his family. So he had a lot of family repairs to make. He had a lot of employer hangover stuff. Man, he was just not a good employee when he was drinking and drugging. And he had a lot of sexual misconduct that was dogging his steps. One of the things he did, which I want to mention because it's right in this wheelhouse at Pavillon, and not often enough in the rooms, I think, at times. On page 133 of the Big Book, it says that we should avail ourselves of professional help. Because sometimes, in my case, a sponsor, a therapist, a spiritual advisor, I needed to go all in on the therapy. So Jack got himself some serious help on the therapeutic front. And the biggest part of that was the therapist helped him work on childhood trauma and to work on a deep sense of sexual shame, because the sexual shame kept coming around. And that's not uncommon for a lot of us. We don't talk a lot about it, but it's not uncommon. So at some point in time, we got into his deeper inventory. And we found out that at his root, he was a people pleaser. And the reason for that was because all of the damage in his childhood, there's that, how we were damaged by life, a lot of trauma in his childhood. And the result of that was that he made a decision based on self, to use the Big Book language, that what he would do is he would do everything he could to keep people around him happy. That was his strategy for avoiding all that terrible traumatizing experience. And it worked to some degree or another, but the stress of it all caused him to become an alcoholic and a drug addict. It turns out that there's a whole lot of history in that family. And so when we look at the sum total of all of that, we find this whole family system, which some of you would know because you've done that work. Well, what was interesting was when we cleaned him up and took him through the process and finally got him into strengths, here's what we found, and it was really, really cool. So, for a long time, he was just inventorying all the stuff he'd done wrong, and he needed to clean that up. Then we finally got to the shift point where we peeled off some of the old ideas. And what we found was part of being a people pleaser is being incredibly capable with other people. We would call him, at worst perhaps, a seductionist. He had the ability to seduce people, not just women, not sexually. He had the ability to lure people into conversations. He had the ability to take them down paths of making decisions. And the result is that today, I think he's 12 years sober now, he is an incredibly effective salesperson, because the same traits that make for people pleasing and problems make for extraordinarily effective sales. Not only that, he's so good at wooing people along, he's been promoted up the chain to a pretty high rank, because it turns out those same people-pleasing tendencies make him extraordinarily good at building teams. So he's a leader, he's a manager, he's a sales guy, and better still, Jack builds powerful teams. So all of a sudden, we got this guy who had all these problems which were related to drinking and drugging. We flip it on its head, clean up the debris, and suddenly we find out that there's strengths underneath all of that stuff that was causing him such trouble. So I want to show you, first of all, some of you probably went off and accepted some of the guidance I offered last week. I had offered to send you all off to take some assessments. There's a book called StrengthsFinder 2.0, and we'll put that link in later. And there's a website called Top 5, Clifton Top 5. These are things I use professionally because I do a lot of developmental work outside the rooms now. And have just started doing this a lot more in the rooms in the past 5 to 7 years. So there we go. There's the things Reed is putting in there. Thank you, Reed. So you all can go look at those. And if you didn't do them, one of you at least I know went and found some other strengths tool. Great. I don't make any money off these. I just take what I can find that works. And so whatever, it's a different way of thinking about ourselves. So I'm going to share something here for you because I want you to see what this looks like. You should be able to see this screen now. Reed, can you see the screen okay? Okay, great. So this is a sample of what strengths look like. And the particular framework we're using here is to take these strengths, you see them here shown as positivity, relator, responsibility, restorative. I'm going to say a little bit about these. I picked these because they have so much relationship to people I've worked with in recovery and myself. And then the way they frame this is they talk about what takes us to the balcony. So how do we use this? Here's the flip sides of the coin. How do we use something that takes us to the balcony to use these things with great effectiveness versus when do we use them in ways that take us down to the basement? So when do we use them well? When do they take us in the wrong direction? And I'm going to take one right here. I'm going to take this responsibility theme. Now, what executing means is it's a way of operating. We do responsibility. It's so relevant to people in recovery. So here's what it says, and this is beautiful. If you have this kind of a strength, you take psychological ownership of what you say and do. That is such a great description. They are committed, they believe in honesty and loyalty. That's a responsibility trait. And what these assessments do is they help you understand which of these you have in you. And reminder, these come from some strange mix of how you were born genetically and what you were exposed to as you were growing up, and you become this anomalously capable person in something. So here's where it gets fun. When we're really high functioning in responsibility, we can be committed, accountable, independent, trusted, and conscientious. On the other hand, when we go to the basement, when we're operating negatively in these, we can become a micromanager, obsessive, someone who can't say no, which, by the way, there's lots of people in the rooms who do that, and someone who takes on too much. The same strength attribute, responsibility, either going to a positive place or going to a negative place. Now, interestingly enough, when we're drinking and drugging, no surprise, or before we've gotten much recovery, we oftentimes tend to go to the downward spiral rather than the upward spiral. There's another one here that I think is really interesting for people in recovery, restorative, which means they like fixing problems. So not surprisingly, given a lot of us who have a lot of problems, and given a lot of us who believe in sponsorship and working with others, there's a whole lot of people with restorative strengths. They can be good at figuring out what's wrong and figuring out how to solve it. Now, just by saying that, you probably go, well, that's a really useful trait, and it can be. We can be a problem solver, we can be a troubleshooter, we can find improvements and solutions. I had 2 really good sponsors who clearly had this strength. They were really good at helping me sort stuff out, get to the bottom of it. and coach me or sponsor me into better solutions using the steps. On the other hand, problem solvers can become negative and talk about weaknesses. They can become punitive. They can be highly critical of others and themselves. So the same strength, restorative, problem solving, taken to a positive or taken to a negative. There's another one on here I just want to use as another example. There's actually 34 of these, and I'll scroll through them in a moment so you can kind of see them. The Relator, which means relationship building. You're really good at relationships. The rooms have lots of this in them. If you're strong in relationship, Relator, you can be really good at forming relationships with others. They find a deep satisfaction in working with friends to achieve a goal. That sounds like sponsorship and working with others to me. So not surprisingly, there's a lot of Relator strength in the rooms. And at its best, that can be caring, trusting, friendly, forgiving, and generous. On the other hand, some of us have been known to form cliques, become cronies, create inner circles, and play favorites, the same relationality. Now, by the way, you can be an introvert or an extrovert and be a Relator. The introvert Relator is more likely to be sitting in the corner having a one-on-one conversation with someone. The extrovert Relator is more likely to be out crowd surfing in the middle of the whole thing that's going on in the middle of the big AA mashup. So this is just another way of seeing ourselves. And then one more, positivity. We can see this often in the rooms, and sometimes we go to the basement pretty readily with it too. Enthusiasm that is contagious, upbeat, they can get others excited. So these are enthusiastic, lighthearted, energetic, generous with praise, optimistic. On the other hand, if we go down spiral, we can be seen as insincere, naive, superficial, or Pollyanna. I'm going to use this as a really interesting example, and I know you've had this experience if you've been in the rooms much. There are people who will say things like, every day sober is better than the best day drunk. Sometimes those are people who are actually suffering. It sounds positive, but in fact, it's not. But it's not easy to talk about suffering in the rooms, especially if you've got some time. On the other hand, and I know you know these people, there are people who genuinely have found the heart of recovery. And when they talk about their best days, they really are telling the truth. I had a friend who used to say his response whenever you asked him, how you doing? Every time you asked him, he would go, this is the best day ever. And that could either be incredibly phony or it could be real. And in his case, it was real because he had done that inner work and he'd cleaned that stuff up. So I want to just give you a glance at the stuff that's in here. So I'm going to scroll. There are 34 of these, which is what you get from this particular assessment if you decide to use it. There are things like achiever, which are people get a lot of this in AA. A lot of people who like to get a lot of stuff done. Activator is people who can take thought to action. This is that person that you all know in the rooms who says, hey, let's do a get together. I know, let's start a whole new camp out thing we're going to do during the summer. The next thing you know, everybody's going and doing campouts. People who are adaptable, which allows for flexibility. I mentioned this last week, there are people who are really good thinkers. They're analytical. And we sometimes shame them for thinking too hard. There are people who are really good at arranging. These are the ones who tend to do, I was thinking about this earlier, people who do alumni reunions. It's like they're arrangers. They just like figure out how to move everything around. There's belief, which is not faith or religion. It's rock solidness. It's this ability to be really grounded. Some of us have that. There's a command attribute, and you all know some of these people because they can take charge, and just to point it out, they can be really charismatic and hugely beneficial. On the other hand, they can piss a lot of people off because they may not play it very well. There are people who are extraordinarily good communicators, another strength set. Competition, some of us have this because we learned how to be competitive growing up. Connectedness is the ability to see relationships between things. This is the person who you're talking after a meeting about something, and they say, you need to talk to so-and-so. And you'll say, why do I need to talk to so-and-so? And they'll go, bam, 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 bam. You go, I didn't know I needed to talk to so-and-so. They can connect the dots for us. Consistency, which we often find in a lot of our formal servants in the program, people who keep doing things the same way, because we need that. Context. There are people who can tell you the whole history of AA. And sometimes they'll do that in an AA meeting. They'll try and tell you the whole history of AA. Deliberative is a particular style of how we think and operate. Developer is people who develop people and develop ourselves. Discipline speaks for itself. Empathy is a strength. Focus, the ability to stay on things. This is sort of the antithesis of some of us who can be really scattershot. There's a futuristic strength, harmony, ideation, again, good idea generation. Includers are people who bring people into the fold. Individualization is a powerful tool if you have this for working with others, because you see the person for who they are, a particularly unique person. Input is the person who asks questions all the time. You all know these people from the rooms because people try and shush them. Like, they just want to know more, so they just keep asking questions. Intellection is good thinkery. There are learners. I mentioned last week, this is my top strength. Everywhere I go, I learn. Maximizers want to get lots of benefit out of things. Positivity, we saw. Self-assurance. Interestingly enough, a lot of physicians have self-assurance. Significance, the need for me and my work to be important. Strategic, figuring out how to move through things. Woo, winning others over. So there's like 34 of these things. And I just sort of gave you a glimpse, because what we're really supposed to do tonight is to spend a little time translating strengths in a way that we can utilize. So I will share this document in the chat box so that you all can go grab it if you want to. It may help you, because it turns out to be very, very useful in inventory. So here's the link for that document I just shared. And I know you'll probably have to figure out how to channel that to the folks on campus there, Reed. But okay, so that's kind of the way of thinking about strengths. There's all this stuff, it's built into us. We know when our strengths, because we're productive, fruitful, happy, fulfilled, and we'll know when we're not in our strengths because we're dragging ass, we're not happy, we're having difficulties, we may be depressed, discouraged, etc. And I used the example last week of a cactus, which I like to compare myself to. You plant a cactus in the right soil and it blossoms and bears fruit. Wrong soil, it doesn't do so well. It's true of everything. You can take a perfectly wonderful coconut palm and move it up to Michigan, and it's just not going to make it. Wrong soil, wrong setting. So let me talk a minute about how we get this into the steps. This is probably what is more fun for me than anything else, because for those of you who don't know this, we have a 4th step format we use, which I mentioned last week. And we can use the same 4th step format, interestingly enough, to look at strengths. So the 4th step format that we use, as shown in the big book, goes like this. Column 1 is the person or the situation. Column 2 is the story, what happened. I'll give you an example of this in a minute. Column 3 is how it affected us. How did this thing spin out? Guilt, shame, insecurity, lack of safety, etc. Column 4 is often shorthanded as my part, which I today don't think of as a fair characterization. I'll tell you why about that in just a moment. So there's 4 columns: the who or the what happened, how it affects us, what's my part, what am I bringing to this? So let me give you an example of a woman in recovery whose name I'm going to use Rain, short for Lorraine. There's a reason for that, but I guess I can't tell you why. Anyway, I got to know Rain about 10 or 12 years ago and worked with her for a number of years. She's presently off doing her own thing. And by working with her, I mean she was both a professional client and someone in recovery I worked with. So I had a little bit of both. Because as I said, I do this stuff professionally, which is where some of it's coming from. So anyway, She had this problem with a boss. That's column 1. It was a new boss. It was a very demanding, commanding new boss. She happens to have a story. He happens to be ex-military. Okay, that's the scenario. So the story is the boss, the new boss comes in, starts trying to take charge. Rain gets pissed off and starts acting badly. She goes to the basement, right? So, and by the way, she's not behaving well. There's a backstory here. So what's going on there, column 3, how is it affecting her? It's making her more and more frustrated. She's getting more and more agitated. She's getting less and less effective in her professional workspace. By the way, if you all haven't had any work problems in recovery yet, just give it some time. Most of us eventually get around to those, and some of us get around to them a lot. I work for myself because I demonstrated I'm not capable of working very well for others. To this day, that is still true. So I just started my own business. So column 4, what is she bringing to this? Well, this is where it gets interesting. Rain grew up in what we in the professional realm call a low resource community down south, meaning they were poor. They didn't have much access to things. She also grew up in a community, this is how she was damaged by life, that didn't believe that women should be educated or that women should be more powerful than men. So she was dominated from a very early age by the alcoholic and drug addicted people in her community. And she didn't handle it well. In fact, her response to that was defiance. And it sounds like this. When they would say, you know, Rain, you can't fill in the blank, right? Rain's response on her insides was, oh, yeah? Well, let me show you, buddy. That's defiance. And it was a survival strategy. It saved her ass. It also made her a drunk. When Rain finally got out of that community, which is what she had to do, she left her people behind. She has no contact with them today because she can't be there. But that defiance, that drive, not only got her drunk, it got her to college on a scholarship. And then it got her into master's level work, and she ended up with a doctorate degree. She was so driven, and every time she ran into some guy who would tell her she couldn't, her inner voice would be, oh yeah, let me show you. And the result of that drive, that damaged life drive, got her an incredible education and made her very, very capable. Well, so here's the story. Here's how this plays out, right? So her part is she's bringing this whole history to this. And yes, she's acting badly, and yes, she's pissed off. What happened, though, was then she gets a male boss, a new male boss, ex-military, who starts telling her what to do. And if you went where I'm just getting ready to go, you were listening. And on her inside, she says, oh, yeah? Let me show you, buddy. And when we actually inventoried this out, the story is she had a lifetime of being damaged and put down and harmed, including a lot of sexual perpetrations along the way. And she was a drunk. And yet that need to fight her way through was why she was clashing with her boss. Okay, there's the scenario. So what do? We do the inventory, we do the 4th step, we do all the steps, and over a period of time, Rain begins to get some relief because Rain finally understands her old ideas. Rain's old ideas are that she's damaged goods, that she is unlovable, that men are going to do things to her that shouldn't be done to her. So she has to unpack all of that. She gets it all out of there. It turns out that she has some particular strengths. She has an achiever strength, which means she wants to make things happen. She has strategic strengths, which means she can see how things need to move. She can see the future, a futuristic strength. She's like got all these incredible talents. So today, the same boss that she was fighting with has become her ally. She cleaned that stuff up so that now when a demanding male shows up and does that thing, she can own it. She can work her way through it. She doesn't have to respond. And the result is, rather than going to the basement and acting badly, she goes to the balcony and she is extraordinary. It is remarkable to see where she has gone. The same basic traits, because it turns out that same stuff that made her defiant is the same stuff that wants to take her to amazing places. But what had to be done was the damaged goods, the work that had to be done via the fourth step. It had to be cleaned out, and then we could do a fourth step on the positive. So now if she did this fourth step inventory on a more current experience in her present position, she's risen quite far. It would go like this. This is the flip side, because she still has a male boss, different male boss. So situation, workplace, male boss. What happened? The male boss has discovered Rain is brilliant, and he gives Rain space to play her big game, and it is a really big game. The result is, how it affects her is she feels valued and valuable. She feels like she's making a contribution. She feels like her life matters. That's column 3. Column 4, what's her part in this? She is playing in her strengths for all she's worth. And the result is we've got the same person. The steps have cleaned up the debris, fixed and therapy, and good spiritual advisors. All that work has been done. And so she's the same woman she was, just like Jack, the guy who had the story of becoming a salesperson. The same kind of person. So it changes the way we think about the 7th step. Remember, the 4th step is the inventory. The 5th step is where we admit to ourselves, to another human being, and God, the exact nature of our quote unquote wrongs. Well, the 5th step changes then. Admitted to ourselves, to God, and to another human being, the exact nature of our rights, which I know sounds like totally like that is like so not AA, right? Because we're so busily trying to accumulate evidence about what bad actors we are. But I have to tell the same truth. It's just as dishonest to not own our strengths, our talents, our capabilities as it is to deny our failings. We have to be able to do both. That's where this takes us to. It's a realm of emotional sobriety. So what this allows her to do then is to do a different kind of 5th step, which she did in part with me as her, at that point, I was her coach and I was working with her in recovery. So then we go into 6 and 7. Now, suddenly, step 6 and 7, which is where we, basically acknowledge, become willing to have these things remediated, these things removed, these things fixed. And step 7 is where we ask higher power for help with that. Well, 6 and 7 become very different, because now what I'm trying to do is live my way into something that I've been unwilling to see in myself. So in the case of Rain, her 7th step is more like asking higher power to help her see how to take full advantage of these remarkable traits, because she's historically blind to them, because she believes she's just this defiant bitch. That would be her language. The 7th step for Jack today is about letting go of his shame around being a people pleaser and asking higher power to help him fully realize these incredible talents that he has. So it completely changes the way we think about it. And if you think about yin and yang, if you're of the Eastern thought, the Asian thought about, the black and the white with the dots in the middle, of course that would be true, because we're in the intermingling of all these things. So what this gives us is it gives us strengths as a framework we can use. What we also get is we get to use the steps. 4th step becomes different. If you're interested, there's another tool that I actually used for the first time. It comes out of Al-Anon. It's called Blueprints for Progress. And it's an inventory tool that those of you who've been in Al-Anon probably know quite well. It takes a much more balanced look at our quote unquote character defects by looking also at where we are doing things right. So if you don't want to go down the strengths route, if you think this is all a bunch of nonsense or not for you, that's another tool you can use, or you can talk to your sponsor about doing assets inventory. Interestingly enough, for those of you who've been doing some therapeutic work, and I'm sure some of you on campus, that's part of what you're doing with the various things that go on. Many of us have done a lot of that. Some part of what that interventional work does is it tries to help us see things about ourselves that we can't see. If I believe, let me see how I want to frame this. I guess I better use me. By the way, I'm telling other people's stories because, I mean, I could talk about me all the time, but it's a lot more interesting to hear about other stories rather than just me, but they're part of my story because this is the work I do in recovery. But there was a point in recovery where I finally got a look at how damaged, I've got tears. I finally got a good look at how damaged I was. And there's nobody to blame for this. All the people in my life were doing the best they knew how to do. But I got pretty damaged. And there was a day I was sitting in an AA meeting. I was maybe 7 years sober, 6 or 7 years sober. And I was just painfully aware. And I opened my mouth when I was called on and I said, I have discovered that my deepest, darkest secret, my oldest idea is that I'm broken beyond repair, that I'm unacceptable to God. The steps will work for you, but you see, I'm too broken for the steps to work. Well, as long as you're walking around with an old idea like that, all you can manage to do is keep pulling the roof in on your head, which is what I did a lot of. So that's the kind of stuff that the therapeutic work, the interventional work that some of you are going through right now, and some of you are practicing in various therapeutic forums, is getting a good look at this stuff. Because if we go back again to something I talked about in the first session, these strengths and the damage all tend to get built in the first 7 years of our life. If we're in a damaging setting, we end up with more difficult things to work with. Some of us definitely end up alcoholic or a drug addict. So it all points back to childhood development, which I know they say in the rooms, this is not about your childhood. And I say that is not true. It is not true at all. We're a product of what we experienced. And in some cases, that did not serve us well. So let me do a little bit of summary work. And Reed, thank you again for dropping various things into the chat box to keep us tracking. I want to do a little bit of summary work and tell you a little bit of what's coming, and then we will stop and we will see what questions or comments you all may have, or wherever you're going to go with it. So we have to look at what's wrong. Well, we got to get sober, clean and sober. We have to look at what's wrong with us because there's so much shame and guilt in us that has to be dealt with. We've got to look at what happened to us, like the story of what happened to Rain. Rain didn't come out of her mama's womb with a defiance problem. She learned it because of an oppressive situation that ultimately made her a drunk and cost her her family and her community, which was a good thing. You all know this, right? Sometimes we have toxic families we need to leave behind because they're just not going to work for us. We need to get new families. And we have to look at what's right with us, because to tell only the story of what's wrong with us is actually quite dishonest. You all would not be who you are and where you are. Everybody's got strengths. You've got some too. We need to try and find them and bring them out of the darkness. So today, let me just say a word about me. So the nature of the work I do professionally and the nature of this work is all built on my strengths. I have been practicing my strengths all night long with you, and it fills me up. I mean, you're a captive audience, so let's wink, wink and go like, well, it's not like you can talk back, right? So, so here's the deal. I'm a learner. All this stuff I'm passing on is stuff I've been learning. I am a voracious learner. Better still, I have connectedness, which means I want to pass it on to others. So being able to talk with you all about this plays to a strength. I'm a relator, which means I really do love people. I've got this ideation strength, which means I have endless ideas. And Reed, you didn't know this, but each time I prepare for these, I like play out with various ideas about how to present this. It's like, wow, how fun is that? I've got like 10 iterations of this because I get to play with ideas and it makes me happy. And hopefully I bring the best ones forward. And then I also have strategic. And so some part of what I do professionally and with this is how do I present this stuff in 3 sessions in a way that hangs together and makes sense? And how do I do it in a way so it's not just me and my ego? How do I do it in a way so that you all can actually access it and use it? So it turns out I've got this remarkable capacity to do this kind of work. I mean, it allows me to build a progressive recovery. It allows me to do workshops in recovery, which I've been doing for a long time. It pays my bills because, talking to alcoholics doesn't pay. Let me tell you, it's like, even if you're a circuit speaker, it's like, there's a lot of stuff you don't get paid for. And that's like totally okay because it's a different gig. But what pays my way is these very same strengths have given me a business which allows me to do that, which funds a whole bunch of other stuff that will never pay for itself. So I have a life and it all works because I'm in these strengths and it's really unbelievable. When I first got into recovery, this completes the story of me, and then I'll give you a quick summary statement. One day, my second sponsor, guy I worked with for 27 years, looked at me and he said, "Ron, it seems to me you have a contentedness problem." You remember restless, irritable, and discontented? To which I said, "No, I don't think so," because I didn't think I could. I was going to fight that out with him. But eventually what I realized was that I was pretty much nonstop discontented, even in sobriety, which is not uncommon. The stuff doesn't go away just because we stop drinking, drugging, and get a few years under our belt. For some of us, it takes a lot more work. Some of us, we do much. It's an easier path, I guess, or not quite so onerous. So anyway, I have not been discontented for years now. I didn't set out to cure my discontent. I set out to do the step work, deeper and deeper and deeper, with really good sponsorship, really good coaches, really good therapists, really good spiritual advisors, which is a theme that I see over and over again. And the result of that is that my discontent has vanished. But what is left in its place is the strengths-based side of that, is I'm deeply passionate. I've become deeply passionate about this recovery work, this spiritual recovery work, which is far more than not drinking and not drugging. Although that's a hell of a great start. So I literally have been transformed by the step work, by recovery. It has made me into a different person. And I wish I could tell you that was intentional. It's the byproduct of doing the recovery work. So here's what I want to share with you to close. There is a great line in the 10th step in the big book. I know that everybody thinks the 10th step is a step where we watch for where we're jerks and take care of being a jerk. That's actually not what the big book says. The big book says that by now, so having completed 9 steps, we have entered the realm of the spirit. We have entered the realm of the spirit. Our next function is to grow in understanding and effectiveness. I get chills when I say that right now. Our next function is to grow in understanding and effectiveness. And that's what strengths allow us to do. As we let go of those old ideas about ourselves and find these new ways about ourselves, things that were there all the while, we just didn't know it. As we find a way to let them flourish and grow in us, we get to grow in understanding and effectiveness. And it's a really, really sweet and beautiful byproduct. So one last thing, which I will pick up on when we take session 3. Session 3 is we're going to pick up where we left off, and we're going to take it further through the steps, because what I really want to do is get to, in these 3 short sessions, talking about how a person uses amends making, the 10th step and the 11th step, to bring us more fully into a strengths realized life. So I'm going to go to the Enneagram for a moment. For those of you who don't know it, Enneagram. It's a psychological tool that comes from the mystics of Asia, and it's worked with a lot. Father Richard Rohr uses it a lot. Some of you know him from some of the parallels in recovery. And here's the cool thing about the Enneagram, and I love what it tells us, because it's exactly what we're talking about tonight. The Enneagram says you are who you are. Melissa, George, Reed, you are who you are. The secret is to use this recovery work to figure out how to move towards function and integration. So what that means, Meredith, is for you to become the best version of Meredith that you can possibly be. Fred, it means for you to become the most realized form of Fred that you can be. Karen, for you to be the most functional, most realized, most productive Karen you can be. The opposite side, which would be the basement, is we move towards dysfunction and disintegration, which is what we want to move away from. So it's an upward spiral, practiced over time, where we get repaired. That long road of reconstruction the big book refers to brings us slowly and surely more and more into what we would call a strength realized life. And it's a long trudge, but as you've often heard, the benefits are pretty substantial, as you can already experience and know and even begin to realize about the future. So I'm going to stop right there. Next week, we're going to pick up right here. We're going to review a little bit of this. We're going to take it into some more steps and talk about what it looks like to be living in your strengths, which is, for my purposes, an amended life.